Today we're starting a new series where we reflect and look back on the top players in the NHL of the past decade as the 2010s come to a close. Today we're taking a look at the top 10 forwards, and that's coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we're starting a new series looking at the top players of the past decade. Now, we've seen all kinds of the big media outlets put out their lists. Certainly some interesting lists out there. Some other YouTubers have done the same. And I wanted to jump in here, not only do a list, but do my own series where we take a look and kind of break this down a little bit further on the top players. And we're going to do them by position, and we're going to do some other videos as well. Some other top moments and top varieties around the NHL of the past decade. It's hard to imagine that the 2010s are coming to a close. I'm recording this video on December the 31st, 2019. So not only is it the last day of the year of 2019, it's the last day of the decade. When we all get up tomorrow, it's going to be a new year, 2020, beginning of a new decade. So let's look back here of the top 10 forwards of the past decade, and I'll reflect here on some great plays and great players that we've seen here in the NHL. Now, before I reveal the list, I just want to say this was a really difficult task. I mean, looking at all these great players, it's really hard to leave some guys off this list. Of course, I want to know what your thoughts, your opinions are down in the comments. Feel free to debate this list all you want. I will not take offense if your list is different, or if you certainly think players are, should be ranked differently, or there should be other players on the list, or whatever. Either way, I want your opinions down in the comments. It's always fun to have these types of conversations. Now, let's get started here with number 10. And we have Philadelphia Flyers captain Claude Giroux. Now, Giroux was actually the fourth highest scorer of the past decade, registering 715 points, a total of .98 points per game. Now, of course, being the fourth highest scorer doesn't necessarily put him in the top 5 or in the 4th spot on my list here. The only issue with Giroux not being ranked higher is his lack of personal or team hardware. There's no Stanley Cups and no individual trophies like many of the other players that are going to be ranked ahead of him here, but I do think Claude Giroux, oftentimes at least, has been a highly underrated player of the past decade. He's had a fantastic career, always consistent with his point totals. He's had a little bit of ups and downs over the decade, but for the most part, way more ups and downs. A really solid player all around, and he's also proven to be versatile as he's transitioned on multiple occasions back and forth between center and being a winger as well. Certainly a big part of the Flyers' success over the past 10 years. And certainly, I think it's fair to say that Giroux sometimes is a little bit underappreciated from across the fan base of the NHL. Next up at number 9, we have Tampa Bay Lightning winger Nikita Kucherov. Now, Kucherov might not be one of the highest scoring forwards of the entire decade just because of when he started playing, but the second half of the decade has certainly been very dominant for him, certainly registering more than a point per game throughout his career so far in the 2010s. Kucherov put up over 500 points in this decade, and he certainly got some personal hardware to add to it as well, winning an Art Ross and a Hart Trophy just last season. Certainly been a part of a dynamic duo with Steven Stamkos in Tampa. It's hard to imagine that the Lightning do not have a Stanley Cup with guys like Stamkos and Kucherov leading the way here. I mean, they've had such strong NHL teams, all kinds of great regular season success. That elusive Stanley Cup, though, for many of these players have escaped them. Obviously, the Lightning did win a cup in the past, but not with their newest regime of top players that certainly seems to find ways to escape them. But Kucherov's been a dynamic player. I expect him to be a dynamic player leading into the next decade as well in the 2020s. He's certainly a top guy, and it's only a matter of time, I think, before the Lightning finally do capture that elusive Stanley Cup. Next up at number 8, we have Kucherov's pal in Tampa, Steven Stamkos. Now, Stammer's been one of the higher scoring forwards of the past decade, actually the 7th highest scorer with 660 points. He's won 2 Rocket Richard trophies. He had 1 season of 60 goals. Certainly over time, we've seen Stamkos kind of transition from being such a hot goal scorer to being more of a well-rounded player and a little bit more of a playmaker for sure. Certainly plays a big role in a lot of the success that Kucherov has and vice versa. They've really formed quite a 1-2 punch for Tampa, often playing together on the top line, and have certainly put up a ton of points over that process. And like I said, with Kucherov, it's hard to imagine that the former number 1 overall selection, Steven Stamkos, does not have a Stanley Cup to his name, but I do think it's only a matter of time before they make that a reality here. They come so close and has so many great regular seasons. Stamkos certainly has accomplished quite a lot. I know his career started a little bit slow in the first couple of years in the NHL, but things really took off, and he's been one of the top players on a consistent basis ever since. Next up at number 7, we have LA Kings captain Anze Kopitar. Now, Kopitar certainly had a fantastic decade as well in the 2010s, leading the LA Kings to 2 Stanley Cups. He put up 658 points, putting up a point total of 0.88 points per game. That actually puts him 11th amongst the forward group throughout the entire 10-year decade here. But of course, it's the personal hardware and accomplishments as a team that certainly drove him up higher on my list. Not only did his team win 2 Stanley Cups, which he was a huge part of, but he also won multiple Selke trophies as well as a Lady Byng trophy as well. Kopitar has certainly proven to be one of the better all-around, well-rounded players in the NHL on a consistent basis. Of course, he's still the captain there, still has a long-term contract, likely rides things out in LA for quite some time now as he hopefully helps lead them through a rebuild and trying to get them back to their glory days of being a top NHL team and winning some Stanley Cups. But Anze Kopitar certainly deserves to be high up on this list after all the team and individual success. Next up at number 6, we have Boston Bruins forward Patrice Bergeron. Now, Bergeron is actually 20th in scoring throughout the decade, but it's all the other things that he does and brings to the Bruins and to the NHL that really drives him up on this list, as well as all the not only team but individual success as well. Bergeron had recorded 568 points during the decade for a 0.83 points per game total, which is very, very impressive. But Bergeron's recognized as being one of the best, if not the best, two-way player in the NHL. Amongst the forward group. Now, he's got a Stanley Cup to his name after a 2011 Stanley Cup victory where the Bruins defeated the Vancouver Canucks. He also won a King Clancy trophy as well as 4 Selke trophies. I wouldn't be surprised to see them rename this award someday to be the Bergeron Award because he certainly deserves that honor with all that success. Of course, he's been a big part of Team Canada multiple times as well on the international stage, winning gold medals with them in the past as well, playing a bigger role. He can certainly, in those situations, prove to be a very valuable two-way winger. I mean, obviously, in the depth of some of these teams at the Olympics, obviously not everybody can play their natural position, and so he can show that he's very versatile that way. He's been a huge part of the success of guys like David Pastrnak and Brad Marchand with the Bruins as well. He's just really one of the all-around great players. Sometimes doesn't get enough credit, in my opinion, but he certainly is ranking pretty high here on my list as one of the top players of the past decade. Next up at number 5, we have Penguins forward Evgeni Malkin. Now, Malkin, in my opinion, sometimes another player, even though he gets a lot of recognition, sometimes I don't know if he gets quite enough. He's got 659 points throughout the last decade, which puts him as the 8th highest. However, he's missed a fair bit of time due to injuries. If you look at his points per game total, which is 1.16, it's certainly one of the higher totals from across the decade. There's not too many players that have averaged more points per game over the last 10 years than the Russian forward of Evgeni Malkin here. Now, he's helped lead the Penguins along with his teammates to 2 Stanley Cups. He's got a Hart Trophy, an Art Ross Trophy, and a Ted Lindsay Award all in there as well. So you throw in some team success with the Stanley Cups, all the individual hardware, and the high points per game total, even though, like I said, if it wasn't for injuries, Malkin easily, instead of being number 8 in scoring, likely would have been up probably somewhere around maybe 5 or 4, maybe even higher. It's hard to say, but he certainly would have been much higher than 8. That's a given. At any given night, Malkin can dominate a game and take over and lead the Penguins to victories. We've seen recently here with Crosby being out with injury. He certainly seems to elevate his game even more when Sid's not around because he's relied upon that much further. But those two have been one of the best dynamic duos, helping lead that franchise to tons of success over the last 10 years. Of course, they had a Stanley Cup right at the end of the previous decade in 2009, so they technically have 3 cups altogether, but 2 cups in the past decade here for Malkin. Number 4 on my list is Connor McDavid of the Edmonton Oilers. Of course, a young captain in the NHL, proven to be quite a dynamic player, arguably the best or one of the best current players in the NHL from around the world over the past decade. Even though he wasn't there for a big part of it, still put up 435 points, which actually puts him at 45th highest, but that's not bad really considering how much of the decade that he was not in the league. Now, the crazy part about McDavid's stats is you look at his points per game total, and of all these top players, he has the highest. It puts him number 1, which is why he gets on this list. So such a high spot in my opinion. 1.33 points per game so far for young McDavid here, and he's already has a Hart Trophy to his name, as well as 2 Art Ross trophies and 2 Ted Lindsay awards. So that shows how great of a dynamic player he is and how important he is to his team. Obviously, if his Oilers team would have had a little bit more success as a group and gotten into the playoffs more, I think McDavid would have been more in the conversation for at least 1 or 2 more Hart trophies as well. He's been a huge player for them in the NHL really ever since he made his debut after being the former first overall draft pick midway through the past decade. So Connor McDavid makes the list without being a part of the league for much of the decade in the number 4 spot. In number 3, we have the dynamic goal scorer from the Washington Capitals, Alex Ovechkin. Now, I've seen a mini list where he's actually ranked as high as number 2. I'm putting Ovechkin at number 3, and you'll see why here momentarily as I can hopefully back up my claim. But Ovechkin is obviously known more as a goal scorer, but certainly puts up tons of points. He ranked 3rd in scoring throughout the decade, 720 points with a 0.99 points per game clip for him as a player. He got a Hart Trophy, a Lindsay Trophy, a Conn Smythe Trophy, as well as that elusive Stanley Cup, which he recently found here just a couple seasons back, as well as a massive 6 Rocket Richard trophies. He's led the league in goal scoring 6 out of the last 10 years, which is absolutely awesome for Ovechkin. He has a shot at being the greatest goal scorer, not only by argument, by statistic, all time. If he plays long enough, he is on pace that he could possibly catch Wayne Gretzky. The question is will he play long enough and be able to keep up this high level of play long enough to get it done? But it is certainly a strong possibility that it could happen for sure. But I have Ovechkin here at number 3. Now at number 2, we have Blackhawks forward Patrick Kane, which amazingly on an NBC list for the top 10 players of the decade didn't even make the list, which I was certainly shocked by. Patrick Kane was the highest scoring forward of the past 10 years, 755 points. Some of these other guys that I've mentioned, for example, have had higher points per game totals and may have caught him if they hadn't missed time, like an Evgeni Malkin's a prime example there. But Patrick Kane played the entire decade with the Blackhawks, helped lead them to 3 Stanley Cup championships. It's certainly a great accomplishment. The Hawks were one of the top teams of the past decade for sure. He got a Hart Trophy in 13-14. He won the Ted Lindsay Award twice. He's got an Art Ross Trophy to his name as well, certainly, as well as a Conn Smythe Trophy during one of their Stanley Cup victories, which happened in 2013. So Patrick Kane's been a very, very dynamic top player in this league the entire time. I'm not sure why he hasn't been on some of these lists, but not only does he deserve to be on a list, but he deserves to be right up there in my opinion. He's had an absolutely phenomenal decade. Now that leads us to the top spot, which really shouldn't be a huge surprise. That's Penguins captain Sidney Crosby, who come out with 727 points, which puts him 2nd overall, but not by a point per game total. 2nd overall in points, but his points per game is 1.23, which puts him higher than most players on this list outside of Connor McDavid, who obviously played the second half of the decade here. But amongst all the other guys in and around the top ones who had enough games, enough hardware to really be considered, Crosby has 1.23, the highest besides McDavid on this list. Of course, Sidney Crosby has multiple hardwares to his name, including 2 Stanley Cups during the decade. Of course, as I mentioned with Malkin, not that we're going to consider it here, but he did have a Stanley Cup in 2009 as well, so he won 3 cups so far in his career. He also has a Marc Messier Leadership Trophy Award. He's got an Art Ross Trophy to his name. He also won the Rocket Richard Trophy a few years back in 16-17 as the top goal scorer of the league. Multiple Hart Trophies as well. Multiple Ted Lindsay Awards, 2 Conn Smythe Trophies. Crosby has really done it all, including the Olympic gold medals, leading Canada to the golden goal in 2010 at the Vancouver Olympics as well. I do think it's fair to say that throughout the last decade, Crosby has been the best player in the world, and right now is still playing at a pretty high level, and certainly still somewhat in that conversation for sure. So that is my top 10 list. As I mentioned, this was really difficult to put together. Feel free to critique it. Feel free to leave me your comments on what your list would look like down in the comments. We can discuss and debate further. There's certainly no right or wrong here. This is strictly an opinion-based video. So, of course, like I said, I won't take offense if anybody disagrees with any of these selections. And as I mentioned as well, there'll be plenty more videos of this type of series coming here soon over the next coming weeks as we enter 2020. We're going to be doing other recaps of the top 10 players by other positions, and there's going to be other videos as well. We're probably going to look at some of the top 10 best trades, worst trades, that type of thing. All kinds of recaps here of the past decade coming soon, so stay tuned for that. Of course, as always, Happy New Year. I wish everybody the best leading into 2020. I hope you bring in the new year safe and soundly, but have lots of fun as well. It's been a great year. It's been a great decade. And I only wish the best for everybody who supports this channel heading into the next year and into the next decade as well. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and we will catch you next time.